Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOC-ADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. Welcome to the 12th and final episode of the 4th season of Momentum for Change. This is your host, Nora Mosby. It has been a great season of the podcast. We've had so many interesting conversations related to domestic and sexual violence advocacy. And I gotta say, I am really looking forward to today's conversation as well. In our efforts to provide holistic, comprehensive services, advocates must address the fact that many survivors of domestic and sexual violence have pets. And many of these survivors will often continue to have pets before, during, and after the violence has occurred. As a result, there are many opportunities for anti-violence advocates to support survivors around issues of pets, pet care, and advocacy. So here to talk about these opportunities are Claire Coughlin, the director of the Companion Animal Program at the Animal Welfare Institute, and Kitty Lawrence, the director of Community Programs at the Animal Protective Association of Missouri. Claire and Kitty, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. As Nora said, I'm Claire Coughlin. I'm with the Animal Welfare Institute, and I focus largely on how human and animal welfare issues overlap. So much of my work is around supporting survivors and getting access to pet-friendly resources. And we do offer our resources, training and education at a national level. And then my background is actually largely in human services. So while I work out of DC, I'm actually based here in Missouri, and for many years did a lot of in-home and community-based support and education services for families who were at risk of abuse and neglect. So my background is largely in human services, and now I get to do work that kind of blends my two worlds and get to focus on the animal welfare portion and how that relates to human welfare issues.
And do you find that your background in human services continues to inform your work in animal welfare, even though it's not the focus of your work right now?
Absolutely. And I think in many ways it is still the focus of my work, because much of my work is based on the premise that the welfare is inextricably linked. So we cannot care about one without caring about the other. And so it is every single day I find my background in human services is incredibly helpful in the work that I do, and I think shapes a lot of the work that I do as well.
Well, I cannot wait to get into this discussion about that with you, Claire. Kitty, what do you do at the APA?
Well, thanks for having me, Nora. I am the director of community support. We've changed our name for our program from community programs to community support to kind of better illustrate what we do. I have a background in veterinary technology. I went to school for veterinary technology right out of high school. I went on to study art, and I decided to create a lot of artwork around the different relationships people have with animals. Why
Wow.
do we have some animals as family members? Why do we eat some animals? There's like all these complex, difficult relationships. And so some of the artwork I did explored that. And I also found that as I was making that artwork, I was working through some really emotionally tricky experiences I had working in various areas in animal welfare. So I've worked in veterinary clinics, emergency clinics, I've worked for research labs, and I've worked in shelters. And so some of those tough things came up, and I realized that making art about it was really helpful. So I went on to study art therapy counseling, where I got really interested in community support aspect of community arts, creative arts, and also community counseling. So through grad school, I started working with survivors, and some jobs that I had after I graduated, I started working with survivors in a community context. I've always been drawn to animals, so I was hired at the APA initially as a humane educator to work on the team for humane education. and then jumped into the role that I currently am in now. Overall, it's basically I've always kind of worked in the intersection of human and animals in some form or another. So I'm so grateful to be a part of the programs that we offer at the APA that keep pets and people together.
Wow, that is fascinating, Kitty. I'm just like, my mind is blown. Like, I just am so interested in your background, combining your interest in veterinary care and art. Like, that is so
That's phenomenal.
interesting. Would you be willing to share, like, more information about some of the art pieces that you did or just some of the projects you worked on? Because that's such a unique background and so
Very.
interesting.
Definitely. Yeah, so, I worked in animal research for a while. So these are this is a job where I was working in labs where we were doing human-centered research. So, that was done on animals. It's a tough field when you're an animal lover because you recognize that the way that animals are used in research is difficult. And even though in those facilities, there's a lot that goes into planning those research experiments. There's committees that oversee how animals are used, but inevitably, what you're doing is tough. And so I was always kind of struggling with the relationships that I saw with animals and how my role in it when I was working in the lab. So I did some pieces. I did one piece that I sculpted a rat out of wax and cast it in bronze and created it kind of made it look like um, kind of like a robot. So in this piece, there's some mechanical elements to it. I had some of the research studies I was involved in had these skull caps on the rats when they were doing neurological research. And so I kind of made this little model of a rat out of bronze as kind of like an ode. It's kind of like an homage to the lab rat. It's kind of like, thank you for sacrificing yourself for the betterment of all of us. Um,
Wow.
and so I also explored different ways different animals are revered in different cultures. So I did drawings and sculptures kind of highlighting those different relationships, hoping to get people to understand like there's just this complex relationship that we have with animals as
Yeah.
humans, and we recognize the comfort that they can provide to us, but we also use them for things that we need.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so like finding a way to make sense of all that was what I was trying to do with my art.
So you all have both clearly integrated your passion for animal welfare into your careers. Where would you say your passion for animals comes from?
Well, there was a story that my mom always told. She said, when I was a kid, I was about 3 or 4 years old, and I was playing in the attic, and I was discovering all these old clothes and playing dress up. And then she said, I came across an old coat of my grandmother's that had a mink collar on it. And it was one of those older coats. So the mink, still had all of its parts. It was just kind of draped over this. And I saw this and I found this coat and I brought it out to my mother and I was in tears. And I was like, why would somebody do this intentionally? And I just had that sensitivity from a young age. And so that's just grown and influenced my other interests. I've always been an animal lover and I've always wanted to work with them and I find them fascinating. So, like, being able to go through all those different career paths and come out on the other side as being an advocate for animals really feels good.
Ugh, I love that. Claire,
Okay.
where did your passion for animals come from?
Um, well, like Kitty, from a very young age, was always drawn to animals. I absolutely have to credit my late mother. She was a vegetarian. She became a vegetarian when she was a teenager. And so my sisters and I were all raised vegetarians and animal lovers. We didn't actually have any animals until I found my first stray kitten at about the age of 5. So, and after that, it just seemed that we were magnets for animals. She always said we had an invisible sign in our yard that just said, "Please, all strays, come here. These people are suckers, and we'll and we'll take you all in." And it's true. And so everything that I have done outside of my like Kitty, my training was different, and my grad school work, my professional work was all human services based. But aside from that, all of my volunteer opportunities, that's how I know Kitty is. I've been volunteering in many different ways for the APA for, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And with the Missouri Alliance for Animal legislation. And so even as a kid, everything that I enjoyed doing in my personal life had to do with animals. And so getting to the point where again I could use my maybe seemingly different training to benefit animals has been such a joyful thing for me. I always call it my unicorn job, something that I didn't quite know existed, where I can use my background, my professional background, to do what is my absolute favorite thing in the world, and that is to interact with benefit animals. And yeah, it's just been a joy to do. And I any day of the week will always choose the company of an animal, over the company of humans. It's the introvert in me, I think, too, is that I really do genuinely enjoy the company of
Yes.
animals. Cannot
I love
imagine a house without them.
No, absolutely not. And I love that you use the word joy because that is exactly it. Pets just bring so much joy and enrich our lives
Absolutely.
in so many ways. And I think, in particular, for people in crisis, they can bring a lot of peace and comfort and potentially even healing. So, can't wait to talk about that. Kitty, you mentioned that the APA is really active in the community.
Mhm.
And so, can you talk about what programs you have specifically around domestic and sexual violence advocacy?
Yes. Well, the APA is a pact organization, and that's people and animals and community together. So we recognize animal welfare is a shared responsibility. We are dedicated to helping pets thrive by supporting their pet owners. Like Claire mentioned, it works hand in hand. In order for pets to have a better life, we have to make sure that people have a better life. And 1997, APA started the Safe Care program, which is our program that supports survivors. And we started that because we saw that, as the numbers show, 50% of survivors delay getting any kind of help because of their pets. They don't want to leave their pets. And then 71% of survivors are saying that their pets have been affected by the abuse. So, an abuser injured, killed, or threatened their pet. So, starting a program to house animals so that they could be safe and so that their owners can get to safety just seemed like something that we should be offering. And so
Kitty,
we,
can you share that statistic again? I just
yes,
want
yeah,
to make sure I understood it correctly. So, what was it?
50% of survivors delay leaving their abuser out of concern for a pet's safety.
Safety.
And 71% of survivors report their abuser injured, killed, or threatened their pet.
Wow, that's a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah. And
That is significant.
currently, I think it's only about 15% of shelters that support people allow pets. So we're seeing that, hey, we have this need where we have people that are with pets and they have they don't want to leave their pet and they have nowhere to take their pet, but they need to desperately get to help. So it just seemed like a natural way to offer support to pet parents and their pets.
Interesting. Claire,
And
can you? Oh, go ahead, Claire.
no, I was just gonna say, I feel like that number is slowly but steadily increasing of those pet-friendly shelters, but as you said, it's still the minority, absolutely, and so it's so critical to have these other programs in place and other options like the APA, and being able to foster or kennel a pet makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And tell us more about the work that you do with the companion animal program at AWI.
Yeah, so thinking about our programming that is probably most directly related, we operate the our Safe Havens for Pets program, and that is a national directory that is publicly available for survivors, for advocates to access and search. It's searchable by state, by zip code, and you can find pet-friendly resources, sheltering resources in particular in your area. So that includes a DV shelter that's pet friendly, but it also includes places like the APA that have the ability to foster. It includes really a very wide variety of programs. But the requirement is that they have to be a program that is specifically available to companion animals of survivors and have to be providing that like temporary sheltering and care in some way, shape, or form. So we've got, I want to say, close to 1,300 different programs listed nationally. And then we actually added a secondary directory in this last year that focuses more on resources that are specific to people experiencing homelessness with a pet as well. So you can look up not only domestic violence shelters that are pet friendly, but also homeless shelters that are pet friendly. And then with our safe havens work and the rest of our companion animal programming, we do a ton of research, education, and training of professionals, cross training of professionals. So training animal welfare individuals to recognize and respond to signs of domestic violence. How can you support survivors in your community? How can you develop these programs when none exist? And then on the flip side, too, doing training for human services personnel, people like myself who did in home work, who are in these homes seeing animal abuse and maybe not knowing what to do about it. So training them to recognize and respond when they're seeing signs of animal abuse and how to navigate those conversations with clients, etc.
Interesting. And can you tell our listeners where they can find those directories at?
Safehavensforpets.org. And that'll take you
Great.
straight. The homepage is that searchable directory.
Great. And we'll go ahead and include those in our show notes as well. And if listeners are interested in getting training from AWI, is that something you'd be available to do, or
Yes.
what does that
Yeah,
training look like?
absolutely. It varies a lot depending on the organization because, as you'll see when you look at the directory and look at all the different types of programs that are included, different things work for different communities and different things work for different organizations. So it tends to be fairly customizable, but, we're always happy to we have a lot of evidence-based training tools. So we're always happy to share those and always happy to do webinars, volunteer trainings, anything like that for nonprofits or programs who are kind of seeking to develop these services. And all of our trainings are always free.
Wonderful. Well, AWI and the APA are both mission driven organizations with a focus on animal welfare. Can you speak a little bit to how your work around supporting survivors of domestic and sexual violence fits within your mission?
Yeah, I think, again, I I know I'm repeating myself, but I do think that, what we know and what we see every day in our work is that we cannot care about one and not care about the other. That the welfare is absolutely interconnected, which also means unfortunately we have these interconnected forms of abuse as well. And we see that, you know, again, much of the time, animal abuse itself is a tool for domestic violence. So if we're trying to counter that animal abuse, that really, helping the people in that situation is one of the most effective ways to do that.
It's a holistic approach, would you say?
It absolutely is. And I think it's one of the things I do love about the APA and AWI. I've never once had to make the argument that some of these human facing services and resources that that seemingly are very specific to a human services organization or a human services program. I've never once had to make the argument as to why that's relevant because I think both organizations really do value that and see it. And it is not only, important and something we're passionate about, but I think it's a logical thing to
Mhm.
do as well. I think it makes sense for our organizations. And I think there's so much benefit to kind of working things from both sides and putting resources into place wherever you can.
It's really
Right.
a win-win situation.
Exactly.
And for the APA, I think a lot of people are asking, like, why would an animal shelter be involved in something like this? And for the APA, we recognize that people and pets are just connected. And we want people to stay with their pets. We value the human animal bond, and I'll talk more about that. But there's a lot of research that is being done in the medical community and the psychology community showing the benefits of pet ownership or interacting with animals. And so that is for everybody. And that's not just for people in a specific socioeconomic class, that's for everybody. The number of animals that need homes, they outnumber available homes. So we have to make sure that the people that are caring for pets have what they need in order to be able to keep those pets happy. And so, as the director of community support at the APA, we help survivors stay with their pets through crisis. We have a program where we get pet food out to human supporting food shelters so that we know if people are struggling to feed themselves, they're probably struggling to feed their pets. We try to reduce the barriers to veterinary care because we all know the cost of veterinary care is really high. And so that's a huge barrier for people to be able to stay in a home with their pets. So we do offer a low cost or free spay neuter for our North County service area. We have a reduced fee vaccine program in our clinic. And then twice a year, we offer free vaccine clinics to the community. And so we're looking for ways to help support pet owners so that they can continue to keep the pets with them in their homes.
Hmm.
So it just makes sense to us to help survivors stay with their pets because we know the value of that relationship to that survivor. And we know that that pet is better off with that survivor. We know that survivor is better off with that pet. So we want to maintain that connection.
Exactly.
Would you say that the benefits for people with pets is maybe even stronger for people in crisis or for people experiencing domestic or sexual violence?
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Claire.
No, I'm sure we're about to say the exact same thing. Um, Absolutely. I think for some people who are in these dangerous or volatile environments, sometimes their pet is the only source of unconditional love that they have. This is their one source of comfort. Some people report it's their one reason that they keep going. So I do think, when you're isolated, when you don't have a lot of support, that bond can be even stronger, and is incredibly beneficial. Because again, the pet ownership and interactions with pets are physically and mentally beneficial for all of us, anyone. But for those who are in a state of crisis, it can mean that much more. And then, which is why we see it being so difficult for them to potentially face leaving them behind, and why people will refuse to do so because that is their support system.
That's so
Absolutely.
interesting. I never thought of it in terms of just breaking some of that isolation that survivors are experiencing, but it really makes
Yeah.
sense. What would you like to add to that, Kitty?
I just think, adding the research that they're doing with interactions with pets to show that people who are dysregulated. So if you've got a nervous system that's dysregulated because of trauma, you are going to have a hard time finding calm and connection in your life. And a pet is emotionally tuned into you. A pet actually knows that you're feeling uncomfortable. The pet knows that instinctually that you need comforts because for them that is their drive to survive. They understand that, we are their life source. We're the ones that house them and feed them. And they instinctually know that in order for them to get their needs met, that we need to be calm and happy so that they're calm and happy. So pets do a lot as far as helping a person regulate their nervous system when they're dysregulated. Kids, you'll see kids, the programs where kids are reading with dogs. Not only does it help a dog regulate its nervous system, but it helps the child. And if you have somebody that is kind of in a constant state of fear, living in terror, and the dog or the cat that's with them can provide just an enormous amount of comfort. And that is so important to recognize.
Yes.
I feel like what you're saying is that pets are part of a trauma informed approach potentially for service
Absolutely.
providers.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's it. Yep.
So interesting. So, just talking more about service providers in particular and some foundational kind of basic information that service providers might need to know as they are working with survivors. How common is pet ownership in the United States? How often can service providers expect to be working with survivors who have pets?
Sure. So it, of course, varies, but some of the latest numbers are that about two-thirds of Americans do own pets, and that what we have seen is some indication that that number does actually increase in domestically violent homes. I think there can be a number of reasons why that is. But again, one of the things we talk about in training is some of these homes might be those homes that you're going into where there's always a new puppy, but never the same puppy. So that you see these pet ownership rates potentially being higher in some of these households as well. And so it's incredibly common. I think I would be shocked if advocates were not encountering survivors where this is an issue. And I think the most important statistic I can give you is that well over 90% of us of all people consider pets to be family members. And that applies for survivors as well. So not only are 2/3 of Americans going to be pet owners, but those people by and large are going to identify a pet as a vital part of their family, which means that, they need to be served as a part of that family like any other member.
If you're working with people, you're working with pets, is what
Yes.
I'm hearing.
Absolutely, absolutely, and there's some great campaigns out there, like, Don't Forget the Pets, which
Yes.
is, Greater Good Charities and Red Rover,
And
where
Red Rover.
they're saying, "Hey, don't forget to ask about the pets when you're helping humans." But I think, to your question, Nora, what I would like human service providers to know is to understand the importance of the human animal bond. Like Claire said, like there is a true connection that is not superficial. It runs very deep. And for many of these survivors, those pets are the only source of unconditional love that they know. And so, when you are asking them, when a survivor makes a decision to get the care that they need because they have to, they're giving up everything. They're giving up everything they know. And you are asking them to give up the source of one of their unconditional love. I always ask people to think of, back in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. Um, there was a lot of footage being shared of the rescue efforts during the flood, and there's a moment. I remember this so clearly. It was a rescue effort. A man was standing on his house. The water's rushing by. You can tell that the water's rising quickly. There's a helicopter right above him saying, "Please get in the helicopter." And he's standing there with his dog on top of
And
his
he will
roof.
not go.
Oh,
He will not
wow.
go.
No.
And
Wow.
that is the illustration. That is the image I always have in my mind,
Yes.
and that I really want providers to always have when they're dealing with someone when they're asking somebody to give up their pet or they don't have a plan to help that person with their pet. It's another situation where they're being traumatized again.
Interesting.
I've worked with some survivors from rural communities, and they tell me that the advocate that they're working for said, "Just let your pet go. Let him out the door and let him
Let them
run."
run.
And they're terrified of that, to have something
Yes.
that you love, that loves you, that you care for. But just like the man on top of that house during Hurricane Katrina, he would rather die than
Yeah.
Yeah.
let his loved one perish,
Yeah.
and I think we have to be sensitive to that people do not view these as simply animals. We are moving
No.
as a society into these animals are family members. I think that we need to make sure that we have plans for that when we're helping humans through all sectors.
Yes, such a good point. I totally agree. You mentioned rural communities, and I think when we're thinking about pets, we often think about cats and dogs, but especially in rural communities, it can be other kinds of animals. So, what kind of animals fit within the scope of your work? What are we talking about?
Well, I I well, I'll let you answer first, Kenny. What in regards
Okay.
to the APA?
So at the APA, because we are an animal shelter, we have to abide by laws of the kind of animals that we can care for. And basically, the rule of thumb is if you can get this pet at a pet store, it's more than likely something that we can care for. Exotic pets, or wild animals, are not really in something that we can care for. And the reason for that is veterinarians have to have special licenses and training in order to help
Mhm.
those animals, and not everybody has that background and knowledge. So we want to make sure that we have the right support for the animals that are in our care. To your question, we do have requests for some pretty incredible animals that need housed. Especially in rural areas, we have, not only dogs and cats, but there are horses and chickens and pigs and everybody involved. We did help a survivor that had a son that had found a box turtle out in the world and decided to keep it as a pet and slept with this box turtle every night. And
Oh,
so we helped a partner donated an aquarium and a heating rack and all the things that this turtle needs to thrive. And we helped in that circumstance We've had requests for some very exotic lizards. In those cases, we'll try to point people in the right direction and use the resources that we have in the community and the people that we know, and say like, "Can you help them out?" You know, and we'll try to find those connections if we have the access to people that can. But that is a challenge for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, so
Uh,
interesting.
and no, I think I'm just thinking about the amount of times I've had someone call about bearded dragons, like, that has been quite a lot. It has absolutely come up quite a bit, but one of the things about our safe havens directory, because this is such an issue, we've kind of added their tags, program details for kind of some of these specific things. Like, do they have horse accommodations? Do they have plans or options for farm animals? Because it comes up, pets are not just cats and dogs and guinea pigs. They are often goats and chickens and lizards, and so, while it's not as common, there absolutely are resources out there for them. So it is always worth looking. It is always worth using your community partners to try and see if there are solutions. One safe haven we work with, they've had a lot of horses come up. And so they now partner with a horse bed and breakfast where they will volunteer the space for some emergency boarding for horses of survivors. I think I've mentioned the Pigtopia one that is one of my favorites they are in Nashville, and it is specifically a rescue that is dedicated to supporting and fostering the pet pigs of survivors.
Oh,
So there are so many people finding creative ways to do this work and support these survivors, even when they're perhaps less traditional companion animals. So it is always worth looking, because there are some resources out there, and hopefully those are
Pigtopia
just
sounds amazing.
I know, I
I
know.
love that. You all have spoken to some of the dynamics that exist between animal welfare and human well-being. But I want to just check in and see, are there any other similar dynamics between violence against animals and violence against people that you want to speak to? Any other similarities there?
Yeah,
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
think we could talk about it in a couple of different ways. One is we know that the likelihood of certain types of human abuse is going to go up when there is animal abuse present, and that is under any number of circumstances. Kind of thinking through the dynamics specifically when it comes to domestic violence, we also see things like when it comes to financial abuse, we see abusers controlling the survivor's ability to seek care for their animal to provide basic needs for their beloved animal because they can recognize how strong a bond is, and those strong bonds are wonderful and beneficial in many ways, but unfortunately when those bonds are that strong they can also be manipulated, and so
Mhm.
then that animal becomes a tool, not letting the survivor feed the dog or seek medical assistance. You see it with financial exploitation. You see it, with legal abuse issues as well, threatening to, if you leave, you'll never have access to the dog, things like that. That there are just so many different ways. There's actually the power and control wheel there is an approved adaptation strictly looking at pets and pet abuse and how they fit into every type of abuse mechanism that we would typically talk about with domestic and sexual violence, that there is a way in which they can be used as tools for violence. And then similarly, so, one of the ways to do that is by directly abusing the animal, right? Because this is the survivor's beloved companion. And so one way to hurt them is to hurt this animal. And so we do see a higher risk of those happening in the same households. We also see a a severity link as well, where survivors who are reporting that their abuser has harmed, threatened, or killed their pet, they're also reporting more frequent and more severe forms of intimate partner violence as well. So you might see that severity link there also.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, the link is real. There's lots of research about the link,
Mhm.
and it often gets referred to as the link
Huh.
between animal abuse child abuse and elder abuse.
Yes.
And it's important for first responders and human advocates to understand that if you're seeing a situation where there's animal abuse or neglect, look further. You're probably going to find human abuse or neglect in that situation as well. They usually go hand in hand. So it serves as an indicator of further investigation
Yeah.
to look into other supports that are needed. Like Claire, it's just that it's just tied.
Yeah. They're just very volatile household systems that we're talking about. It's never one direction or violence is so much more complicated than that. And it's typically multi-directional. And, I think sometimes the first reaction of people might be, oh, no, I don't see that. That's not my area. But they do see it. We know they see it because we know these things are happening in the same household. So the more we can educate animal welfare people, animal control officers, when you're in a house to look for signs of DV, to look for signs of child abuse. And then on the other side, as much as possible, for us to educate social workers and teachers to, look for signs of animal abuse and know what to do when you see it. Uh, at the end of the day, recognizing and addressing violence in any form in a household is going to increase the likelihood that we can intervene in what is likely a pretty volatile household system and hopefully interrupt some cycles of violence there.
So, some of these similarities between violence against animals and violence against people actually provide opportunities for intervention and support, and maybe potentially
Absolutely.
new community partners to amplify the impact of our work.
Yes. I
Absolutely.
I one of the things we see there have been policy advances where certain states have these cross-reporting laws where we're requiring human and animal welfare professionals to be mandated reporters, things like that. But more than anything, we're seeing so many good cross-training initiatives, and that is the one thing I will always encourage is the value in cross-training. And the value in, if you have a community response team, if you have a DV community response team or MDT that you work with, often they don't involve animal control, but they should. There's a lot of households where animal control might be the first in the door. So think about opening your response teams and your other coalitions up to animal professionals. And similarly, if I'm talking to animal welfare professionals too, I think it's incredibly important that they connect themselves with child and family welfare coalitions, et cetera, like that, because they are seeing this. And often they're seeing this in the homes that they're working in and not knowing what to do about it. So I think for a lot of these professionals, having the resources like a coalition or, some of these partnerships give them really makes their job. No one has an easy job, obviously. I shouldn't say it makes it easier, but it gives them some tools to address the things that they're
Mhm.
already seeing in these households.
I can
Mhm.
definitely see that. Is there
Mhm.
anything you wanted to say about community partnerships, Kitty?
They're so important, just for helping people get their needs met. Our cost of living is difficult, our wages are stagnating, our stressors are increasing. So people are really feeling aggravated, agitated. They might lash out more because of all of the pressures that they're faced with. And I think being able to recognize that intervention in food support, intervention in getting basic needs met is really important right now to kind of things to make sure that people have their basics. If people don't have their basic necessities, they're not going to be able to address those higher level kind of things. So I think it's really important for an animal welfare organization like the APA to recognize that if we support the people in our community, if we give them what they need, figure out what they're struggling with and try to find a way to deliver that, then we have the ability to make sure that people are able to stay home and be more comfortable with pets. So it's a community issue. We don't live in the world in isolation.
Well,
And so it's really important to recognize the partners that are in our community. They're already doing some incredible work and to make those connections so that we can support people and support pets and just have a happier coexistence because of that.
Yes.
I do think, we are all of us that work for wonderful nonprofits, and we know how stretched thin a lot of the nonprofit world is and helping professions. I think whatever we can do to utilize the resources around us and use our community partners, right, so that we're not all reinventing the wheel. Um, we kind of I think it's helpful for everybody as well because we don't not every organization has the capacity to take on all of these things themselves. That's just not how we're not equipped. But there are people who are equipped to do it, and so the more we talk to each other, the better we are all for it.
You all have spoken about the similarities between violence against pets and violence against people. Are there any differences that you'd like to speak to?
Well, there
That's
are
a good question.
sure. So one thing I can say too, there are similarities and differences when we're talking about like physical signs when I'm doing trainings. That's always kind of interesting to think about because there are some similarities when we're talking about like physical injury where when I'm talking about signs of animal abuse, like it's going to sound familiar to someone who is trained to look for signs of child abuse. When I'm talking about like injuries in multiple stages of healing, parallel injuries on a body, we don't typically have an accident where people and or animals where they're getting these parallel injuries on accident. So there are an awful lot of similarities in some of these things, but then there are differences as well. Some very obvious ones are things like we can't always see some of the things that we might see in a human and an animal, right? We don't see bruising in the same way because of animal fur. So there are kind of special considerations, certainly, but there is enough overlap that I think, again, we don't all have to be experts on something that's outside of our area, but knowing enough to know the red flags and who to get involved. Kitty can probably speak, especially
Yeah.
to the physical pieces as well.
Yeah, with animals, I think people think that animals don't develop a post-traumatic stress disorder
Oh, they
when
do.
they do. I think recognizing how that looks in animals and how it's different in people is important. With animals, but you may see, with a survivor that's already that's out and getting assistance, they're already going through this tumultuous time of upheaval and change. So there's a lot of indicators that an animal is stressed. So you're going to see animals, they're going to stop eating. They're not going to be sleeping. They may have accidents in the house. And so a lot of those changes in behavior can be attributed to this huge change that they're
Yeah.
undergoing, but it's also a sign that they're experiencing some traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And so, one thing that we have seen in our program where we have an animal from a survivor that's in a foster situation, one of the questions we ask at intake is how do your pets respond around children and men and women? And
Hmm.
have you noticed a difference? And sometimes we'll see that a survivor will say, like, no, this dog gets along with everybody. We never see any issues. And then in foster, the fosters report to us like, oh, I had a friend over and they got really aggravated at this strange man in the kitchen. We had one foster whose husband traveled a lot for work and was out of town for long stretches. And this foster was taking care of a dog, and the husband came home in the middle of the night, like he normally does, and the dog was staying in the bedroom with the foster, and the dog would not let the husband in the bedroom. Absolutely would not let him pass the threshold.
Yeah.
And this was the first when, the foster reported that to us. And of course, that was an issue for the foster. She wants to also be with her husband, but also, the pet owner was shocked to hear this. Like that had never happened before. So after the abuse, the dog had developed a fear of men, and the bond that that dog was able to develop in a short period of time with its foster, it showed us that it wanted to protect that foster from this perceived threat of this man coming in the
Yeah.
house. And those behaviors can also develop, in foster care while we're caring for the animals after a survivor leaves a situation, and they may never have seen that behavior with an animal before.
And I think you bring up such a good point too that it also can look quite different than other foster animals through a shelter program as well. There are definitely special considerations, safety things for a foster, but also it's a really important reason why you have such a wonderful intake process too, right? And so many of these organizations and programs do, because you want to know what triggers. And again, it might not always be things you're prepared for that the owner reports, but also knowing like what calms them. What do they respond well to? Can we provide things with their scent, with the owner's scent on it, so that they have something that, is comforting and reminds them of their owner. So, having that thorough intake process, again, it's never foolproof, because once those environments shift, these things, these anxieties or traumatic responses can occur. But having as much information as possible is really incredibly important.
You all mentioned public policy earlier, and I'd love to continue that conversation of public policy by talking about the ADA. And so, what do you all, in your expert opinion, what do you all recommend that service providers know about service animals and emotional support animals? Like, what's the difference there? What do you need to know as a service provider?
So we will frequently get animals and people referred to our program, and we hear that an advocate will tell this person, will tell the people that you're requesting care from that it's a service animal. And we understand that this sort of helps create more value for us to, for the animal to stay in a situation. But I wanted to correct that and just let people know that, service animals are different from emotional support animals. And a service animal has usually undergone some kind of intensive training in order to serve as a particular need for a person. So we're all familiar with seeing eye dogs. That is a service animal. There are dogs that are trained to detect seizures. There are dogs that are trained to detect changes in a person's physiology from a heart condition.
Hmm.
That is all stuff that service animals do. Now, naturally, some pets owners have come to me and they have a certain condition, and their pet naturally kind of picked up on a seizure disorder and has a way of telling a person, "Hey, I think you're having a seizure," and they pick up on that without having been trained, and that's a pretty cool thing that happens. But for the most part, it's really important for service providers to understand that service animals are these very highly specialized trained animals, but emotional support animals are different. Emotional support animals don't need any special training. All they need is a letter written from a mental health provider, which can be a doctor, a nurse practitioner, or a therapist licensed in that person's state, that explains that having this pet benefits this person because it helps them with PTSD, it helps them with anxiety, it helps them with sleep. And so it's actually just a letter written from a healthcare provider saying this animal benefits this person just by being in their lives. And that letter allows people to keep their animal with them in living situations where they normally couldn't have pets. So you may have an apartment complex that has a no pet policy. You may have size restrictions or breed bans. So for the survivor that's got the 75-pound pit bull, and can only find pet friendly housing in a place that will only allow like dogs under 25 pounds, this is a great tool to allow them to stay together.
Hmm.
But again, it doesn't require any special training. There's a lot of organization, or there's a lot of companies out there that are looking to profit off of an ESA.
Hmm.
The best way for a survivor to get an ESA letter is to actually ask their healthcare provider. We understand that some survivors don't have a healthcare provider, so we have a system at the APA where we can help those survivors get those letters. And those letters are they do give you the ability to not have to pay pet rent and not have to pay a pet deposit. So that's also a huge advantage. Yeah.
Good to know.
And
Yeah.
that I do think, if I could be wrong, so, but I think that does vary somewhat by state as well, right? So depending on, like, certain states have certain regulations in place, but
Mhm.
or they have to have had like a lengthy therapeutic relationship, or not at least a 90-day relationship with the
Hmm.
person who's writing the letter. So depending on the state you're in, there can be different policies in place, but yeah.
You all have just brought up so many interesting, fascinating points. It's just been a delight to have this conversation with you. I've learned so much about the connection between pets and people. So I just thank you for sharing all of this wisdom. As we're wrapping up, I would love to hear if you have any stories to share about the impact of your work as you just reflect on the changes that you've seen happen or the positive impacts. Is there anything that comes to mind?
I love the moment when we get to reunite the pet with the owner. And so for our program at the APA, our safe care program, when pets are in foster, we don't allow business visits for safety reasons. So a pet owner may go 2 or 3 months without seeing their pet. We'll give them weekly updates. We send pictures. They know how they're doing, but they haven't physically seen them in 2 or 3 months. So there's always that incredible moment when the
Aw.
owner comes to pick up their pet and the pet comes out and doesn't really know what's going on, but when they kind of recognize each other and they just get so excited, and to see that reunion is always so heartwarming because you see the bond that's there. You just it's incredible. And just the love that that the owners express the gratitude. Everybody has that funny, cute way of talking to their pets, and to see that just see that pet parent just, kind of do their baby talk and just melt into that reunion. It's just so heartwarming. And I've seen it with dogs, cats, guinea pigs, you know,
Yes.
the turtles, like just to see that love. It's just so heartwarming. And you just feel so great that you're able to maintain this relationship
Oh,
through such a hard time. And you just see the value in it. And I can't express how genuinely heartwarming that is.
that unconditional turtle love. I love it.
And I have a story I'll share, but I did as it relates to kitties first, I think too you see this effect on people who foster specifically for these programs as well. I think
Mhm.
these programs are really they are quite different than fostering for other types of programs, and I think it draws a unique volunteer base. These are people who are dedicated to supporting survivors, and this is a really powerful way they can do that without also having that, traditional fear of foster failing because the goal is reunification. The goal the entire time is reunification. And so they have this really powerful way that they can help a survivor and hopefully get them to that reunification point, which I think is amazing for, even if a foster doesn't get to witness it, just being a part of that journey is so impactful for them. And then the story I'll share, just a positive one for me that was more recent. One of the programs that we worked with that we did some grant funding for, and it was a partnership between a domestic violence shelter and an animal shelter where the animals were either kenneled at the animal shelter in kind of a confidential space or they were fostered. In this case, a woman came into the DV shelter with her two cats. Those cats were taken to stay at the animal shelter. They did have a unique setup where there was a secure way for visitation, and she spent every single day going over and visiting her animals while they were in the shelter, to the extent that she got to know the animal shelter staff, and they ended up hiring her as a staff
Aw.
member at the animal shelter. She got a job, an income, she got her own safe housing, was able to take those cats back, and was just a really, really full circle moment. And I remember this shelter manager, shelter director, the animal shelter director saying, like, what an impact that had on their animal shelter staff because typically they don't often see the impact of these programs necessarily in quite that same way. So it really just helped everyone to see how vital it was that they were partnering with this DV group because it was just a perfect illustration. So
Those are such beautiful stories. Thank you so much for sharing. Any final thoughts as we're wrapping up here? Anything you wanted to be sure to speak to?
I think it's just important. I know that it can seem daunting. I think a lot of our advocates are already overwhelmed. So the idea of like, okay, we got to add pets to this can seem
Yeah.
super overwhelming. But there's a lot of resources out there to help with this. And if you can't physically shelter a pet, to what Claire was saying, the fostering is a great opportunity. You've got a volunteer base. Asking some of those volunteers to kind of be on call for a survivor that needs A pet house is a great way to come up with a plan. Partnering with local animal shelters and veterinarians or boarding facilities.
Yes.
To a lot of boarding facilities will work out a reduced fee. There's grants available. RedRover.org offers lots of grants. They have a program where you can learn how to say you've got a storage closet that isn't really doing much. They can show you how to turn that into like a place
They have
to
a coaching
house.
program.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Cool.
So there's so
Wonderful.
many ways to do this, and a lot of times, it just kind of takes a little coaching and, kind of looking at the resources that you already have in a different way. I'm sure there's ways to do this that we haven't even tapped into yet, and I think just, again, finding those community partners to do that, with is really important.
Excellent point.
I would say a similar thing is that it doesn't have to look a certain way. There's not just one solution. I think when we can have survivors and their pets stay together, that's wonderful. We recognize it's not always an option for everybody. Sometimes we have to foster to kennel, but it can be overwhelming. Like you said, I think a lot of people think that this is a huge undertaking, and it doesn't have to be. And you can start small, start with some, safety planning steps, start with, one community partnership. I think that there are so many different ways that people and organizations and communities do this work that's effective. It just doesn't all have to look one way, and it doesn't all have to be, let's start with a huge overhaul. Start with something small. Or, as you said, use your community partners and also look to the other groups that are doing this. As I said, there are some very oddly specific organizations out there that are doing really cool work and they're really passionate about it. So, someone is out there doing the work. So, you know, we don't always have to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from other people who are doing it. We can get advice on how to handle some of those sticky situations. So, AWI, our program, we're always happy to help connect groups to other organizations that maybe have been in a similar circumstance and kind of found their way to a really impactful program. But yeah, just think creatively, start small, and it doesn't have to look one way. Think at the end of the day, anything you can put into place that supports pets with survivors is a step in survivors with pets, pardon me. Anything you can put into place is going to be a step in the right direction for both the person and the pet, without a doubt.
Beautifully said. Thank you. You all, Kitty and Claire, this has been such a great conversation. I've learned so much. I can't wait for our listeners to hear it. So thank you so much for joining me today. You just made so many important points and brought so many great things to our attention. So thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We really appreciate you all joining the conversation as well. And we look forward to bringing you a new season of Momentum for Change in January.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Nora.
Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.